What if I told you? World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, started with a fake radio broadcast. Not a missile launch, not a real invasion. Just a bunch of Germans pretending to be Polish saboteurs, yelling into a microphone in broken Polish, and a few poor souls dressed up, murdered, and left behind as proof. Yeah, that's how the Nazis launched a world war. Welcome to one of the strangest, darkest, and most absurd moments in human history, the Gleiwitz Incident. The night Germany lied its way into invading Poland and convinced the world for at least a few hours that it was the victim. It's a story that sounds like a bad spy movie written by a drunk screenwriter, but it's 100% real. And the best part, they actually thought it would work. Our story begins in late August 1939, a world on edge. Europe was holding its breath. Hitler had already absorbed Austria, bullied Czechoslovakia into submission, and now had his eyes on Poland. But there was one small problem. Even dictators need an excuse. He couldn't just waltz in and say, "Hey, I feel like conquering Poland today." No, he needed to look like the good guy, like the victim. Like Germany had no choice but to defend itself from a Polish attack. And that's where things get unhinged. Hitler's inner circle, the men who specialized in nightmares, came up with a plan. A fake attack, a false flag operation so bizarre it could only have come from the mind of people who wore skull badges to work. The operation's code name? Operation Himmler. Yes, that Himmler. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, part-time war criminal, full-time overachiever in evil. And his right-hand man, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the coldest, most ruthless minds in Nazi Germany. Together, they cooked up a scheme that would make history's most ridiculous villains look like amateurs. The idea was simple. Fake a Polish attack on Germany. Make it look brutal. Make it loud. Make it believable enough that the average German listening to their radio that night would think, "Oh no, those terrible Poles, they've attacked us. We must fight back." And Hitler could step in reluctantly and say, "Fine, I didn't want war, but they left me no choice." That was the plan. Now, how do you stage something like that? How do you make a fake war look real? Easy, you get creative. And by creative, I mean unbelievably evil. The SS organized several fake border attacks. They picked a few spots along the German-Polish frontier and planned to stage them as if Polish forces had crossed over. They'd burn a few buildings, fire a few shots, leave behind evidence. You know, classic stuff. If your idea of evidence includes murdering innocent people and dressing them in fake uniforms, because that's exactly what they did. They took prisoners from concentration camps, men who were never supposed to come back, and used them as props. They were dressed in Polish military uniforms, shot and dumped at the scenes of these attacks. The SS called them Konserven, canned goods, a grotesque little euphemism for human lives used to decorate a lie. And among these fake incidents, one would stand out. The centerpiece of the whole performance, a small radio station near the German town of Gleiwitz, close to the Polish border. August 31st, 1939. The world was one day away from the war that would consume it. That night, under cover of darkness, a squad of German operatives rolled toward the Gleiwitz station. They were dressed like Polish soldiers, mismatched uniforms, painted equipment, even fake Polish insignias stitched onto their sleeves. At their head was a man named Alfred Naujoks, an SS officer with a reputation for getting things done. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd want to share a drink with, unless you enjoyed people who bragged about war crimes. His mission was simple. 1. Storm the radio station. 2. Broadcast a short message in Polish, claiming that Polish forces had just invaded Germany. 3. Leave behind evidence, meaning the bodies. That was it. 3 steps. Start a world war. And the scariest part, it worked. At least for long enough. Naujoks and his men stormed the station just after 8 p.m. They overpowered the small crew inside, civilians who had no idea what was happening. Within minutes, the building was under Nazi control. Then came the big moment, the broadcast. A garbled, panicked message in Polish went out over the airwaves. Attention! This is Gleiwitz. The station is in Polish hands. The time of Germany's fall has come. It lasted less than a minute. The voice, not a Polish soldier, just a German operative pretending to be one. The accent was bad, the grammar worse. If it were a TikTok, the comments would be full of laughing emojis and "bro, what is he saying?" But in 1939 it didn't matter. People believed what they heard. The illusion was enough. Outside in the dark, the SS staged the final piece, the bodies. Several prisoners were brought in, already wounded or unconscious. They were shot, laid out at the scene and photographed. Fake Polish soldiers who had died in the attack. And then, just like that, the squad left. The station fell silent again. But the damage was done. By morning, the headlines screamed, "Polish forces attack German radio station. Germany defends itself from aggression." And Hitler got exactly what he wanted. His excuse. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border. Bombs fell on Warsaw. The world's deadliest conflict began. All because of one staged radio broadcast and a few murdered prisoners. That was the night Germany faked its own victimhood, and the world, at least for a few hours, believed it. The next morning, Germany woke up to chaos, but not the kind that happens when your alarm doesn't go off. This was the chaos of carefully manufactured outrage. Newspapers across the Reich blared the same story. Polish aggression, German blood spilled. And the propaganda machine didn't just move fast. It sprinted like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And of course it had, because everything that happened in Gleiwitz that night wasn't just about the raid. It was about the narrative. The Nazis didn't care about truth. They cared about the story. And in their story, Germany wasn't the villain, it was the victim. You see, Hitler had been testing the limits of the world's patience for years. He had taken Austria, no real punishment. He had bullied the Czechs, a few protests, but nothing serious. Now he wanted Poland, but he needed to make it look justified. And this? This was his reason. A flimsy, tragic, perfectly orchestrated excuse. Within hours of the fake broadcast, German radio stations, newspapers, and state-run news agencies were repeating the same lines, word for word. Poland has attacked our border. German soldiers have fallen. The Reich must defend itself. It was an avalanche of lies. And for many ordinary Germans, it worked. They didn't see the SS officers with fake uniforms and dead prisoners. They saw headlines, they heard radio hosts, and they believed. Because here's the thing about propaganda. You don't need to convince everyone. You just need to make sure no one asks questions. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man misse. Across Europe, the world tried to make sense of it. Foreign diplomats in Berlin were caught off guard. Their phones rang all night as reports came in of Polish attacks along the border. British and French embassies scrambled for information, trying to verify what was happening. But they couldn't, because there was nothing to verify. It was smoke and mirrors, chaos and corpses. By the morning of September 1st, the truth didn't matter anymore. German tanks were already rolling into Poland. Planes screamed overhead. Villages burned. The invasion was happening, and Hitler didn't care who believed his story anymore. Because that's how lies work. Once you've told the first one, reality doesn't matter, only the momentum does. Inside the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Hitler gave a speech that morning. It was broadcast across Germany, into cafes, schools, factories, and homes. Millions listened as his voice, filled with theatrical outrage, boomed across the airwaves. For the first time tonight, he declared, Polish regular soldiers have fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m. we are shooting back. He said it like a man cornered, like a man reluctantly defending his homeland. But behind the outrage was calculation, cold, deliberate performance. And the crowd cheered, because that's what propaganda does. It turns lies into theater and theater into war. Zeichen die Filmwasses, den man misse. Meanwhile, in London and Paris, the news trickled in. Reports from Poland described German bombings, not Polish ones. And slowly the world realized the story didn't add up. But by then it was too late. Wars don't wait for fact-checkers. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially begun, and the Gleiwitz Incident faded into the background, overshadowed by the explosions that followed. But make no mistake, this was the spark. A spark that came not from a gun, but from a microphone. Zeichen die Filmwasses, den man misse. Behind the scenes, though, even among the Nazis, not everyone was proud of what happened. Alfred Naujoks, the SS officer who led the fake raid, would later describe the operation in cold detail, not out of guilt, but self-preservation. Because when the war turned against Germany, he tried to use his role in Gleiwitz to save himself, handing over confessions to the Allies like, "Hey, I was just following orders. Also, here's a fun story about how we started the war." And historians would later piece together how absurdly sloppy the whole thing actually was. The fake Polish broadcast, barely audible. Half of it cut off by static, and most people in Germany didn't even hear it. The bodies left behind, their uniforms didn't fit. Their Polish boots were German-made. One of the corpses still had German tattoos. It was theater, yes, but low-budget theater. And yet somehow it worked. Because it didn't have to be believable. It just had to be loud. Zeichen die Filmwasses, den man misse. It's strange, isn't it? The idea that the deadliest war in human history began not with a bomb, but with a broadcast. Not with truth, but with a story. And that's the part that sticks. Because when you look at the Gleiwitz incident, you realize war doesn't always start with an army. Sometimes it starts with a lie that people are too afraid to question. If Hitler was the face of the Reich, then Joseph Goebbels was its voice. And what a venomous, brilliant, terrifying voice it was. Goebbels wasn't a soldier. He didn't wield guns or tanks. He wielded words, and he knew exactly how dangerous they could be. He once said, "A lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth." And that became the anthem of the Nazi information war. While the world was still confused about what happened at Gleiwitz, Goebbels was already busy turning it into legend. He knew that people didn't need to hear the truth. They needed a story they could feel. So he gave them one. Poland was the aggressor. Germany was the victim. The Führer was reluctantly defending his people. The brilliance or horror of it all was how organized it was. There were no accidental leaks, no mixed messages. Every newspaper, every film reel, every radio broadcast, synchronized like an orchestra of deceit. Goebbels called it total propaganda. To him, propaganda wasn't about spreading lies. It was about shaping reality. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man Messer. Inside Berlin's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, yes, that was the actual name, Goebbels had built a machine unlike anything the world had seen. Imagine a government department where every newspaper headline, every song, every movie script had to be approved by one man. That was Nazi Germany. Filmmakers, artists, writers, all forced to work under his command. If you wanted to publish anything, you had to pass the Goebbels test. Does it serve the Reich? Does it glorify the Führer? Does it make Germans feel victimized or superior? Preferably both. And when it came to the Gleiwitz story, he passed with flying colors. Within days, state-run newsreels showed images of burned radio towers and lifeless German bodies, while narrators thundered about Polish brutality. Never mind that most of it was staged. The footage looked convincing. And that's all that mattered. Because Goebbels understood something most politicians still don't. Facts don't move people. Emotion does. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man Messer. As the invasion of Poland continued, Goebbels flooded the airwaves with dramatic reports, many entirely fictional, describing Polish atrocities. He wanted Germans angry, terrified, and united. He wanted them to feel like they were fighting for survival. And it worked. People lined up to volunteer. Crowds cheered as columns of Wehrmacht troops rolled through Berlin. Women threw flowers at soldiers marching off to what they thought was a noble defense. But behind the cheers were whispers. Some people knew something was off. How could Poland, a country a fraction the size of Germany, possibly launch dozens of attacks overnight? Those questions didn't last long, though, because in Nazi Germany, asking questions could get you killed. Meanwhile, foreign journalists stationed in Berlin faced a nightmare. The Nazi regime controlled every press release and censored every telegraph. Reporters who tried to fact-check the German story were followed, threatened, or expelled. It was information warfare, 1939 edition. Goebbels didn't need to convince the world that Germany was innocent. He just needed to make the truth too confusing to see clearly. And in that fog of confusion, Hitler's army marched deeper into Poland. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man Messer. But let's pause here. Because while the Gleiwitz Incident was one of Goebbels' most infamous operations, it wasn't his first experiment in weaponizing the truth. Years earlier, during Hitler's rise to power, Goebbels had perfected the formula. He would start with a seed of truth, just a tiny one, and grow it into something unrecognizable. If a German was attacked in a border town, it became proof of a global conspiracy. If a riot broke out, it was evidence that Germany was under siege. He took fear, that most human of emotions, and gave it direction. Don't fear chaos, he said. Fear the people we tell you to fear. And in 1939, that target was Poland. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man Messer. The propaganda campaign wasn't just domestic. It was exported, packaged, translated, and delivered to embassies across Europe. German diplomats handed out glossy reports of Polish aggression, complete with photos and forged witness accounts. And while most governments didn't buy it, they hesitated, and hesitation was all Hitler needed, because wars don't begin when the first shot is fired. They begin when the first lie is believed. Seitdem die Filmwasses, dann man Messer. Back in Germany, Goebbels celebrated. He wrote in his diary that our propaganda is working beautifully. He even joked about the Gleiwitz stunt, calling it a perfect operation. There's something chilling about that, isn't there? A man so intoxicated by his own manipulation that he saw global tragedy as a performance success. But that's who Goebbels was, an artist of deceit, a man who could turn death into a headline and headlines into applause. Seitdem die Filmwasses, den man misse. It's easy from the distance of decades to think, how could people have fallen for this? But propaganda doesn't need to make you believe the whole lie. It just needs to make you doubt the truth. And once you're unsure, once you start saying, well, maybe there's something to it, that's when they've already won. By the time the world realized the Gleiwitz story was fake, it didn't matter anymore. Millions were already dying, cities were burning, and the machinery of war, once it starts, doesn't care who pulled the lever. The radio station in Gleiwitz went silent. The uniforms were buried. And the lie that started it all became just another footnote in a mountain of human tragedy. Seitdem die Filmwasses, den man misse. But Goebbels' legacy, that didn't die with him. His understanding of mass manipulation still echoes through modern politics, advertising, and media. The tools have changed. The screens are brighter, the algorithms smarter. But the principle is the same. Control the story and you control the people. By dawn on September 1st, 1939, the lie had already taken flight. German newspapers screamed headlines like, Poland attacks German frontier and our troops respond to aggression. The radio echoed with the same fury, carefully orchestrated outrage pouring from loudspeakers in every city and town. And while ordinary Germans rushed to the streets shouting, Justice for Gleiwitz, far beyond their borders, the world woke up to chaos. In London, the BBC scrambled to verify the news. Was it true? Had Poland really launched an attack? Reports were conflicting. German officials were confident, calm, rehearsed. Polish diplomats, panicked and confused, swore they had done nothing. The British press didn't know who to believe. And that was the point. Goebbels didn't need everyone to believe Germany. He just needed the truth to take longer to catch up. Because in the age of telegrams and radio relays, a lie could still outrun the truth by days. And Hitler only needed hours. By mid-morning, the Wehrmacht was already storming across the Polish border. Columns of tanks rolled over farmlands and villages. Luftwaffe planes shrieked overhead, bombing railways, bridges, and cities like Wielun, one of the first to burn. At 10 a.m., Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag in Berlin. He stood before the assembled deputies, his face grave, his voice trembling with righteous anger. This night, he declared, regular Polish troops fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m., we are returning fire. The room erupted in applause. The lie had done its job. The invasion was not an act of aggression. It was retaliation. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, the reaction was disbelief. Polish commanders, stunned by the sudden German onslaught, demanded explanations. How, they asked. Could anyone believe we started this? But by then it didn't matter what they said. German radio had flooded the airwaves with witness accounts, photographs, and reports of Polish attacks. All fabricated, all carefully timed. The entire narrative had been preloaded, like a stage play performed on command. Inside the Polish embassy in London, The ambassador, Count Edward Raczynski, tried desperately to counter the German claims. He sent telegrams to foreign offices, pleaded with British officials, and called journalists into emergency press briefings. "We did not attack anyone," he said. "The German government is lying." But skepticism lingered. Was this a desperate denial or the truth? Even as British intelligence officers began to suspect something was off, the confusion was enough to buy Hitler crucial time. Across the Atlantic, the news reached Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt listened to his morning intelligence briefings in silence. America, still deep in isolationism, was in no mood for another European war. Newspapers in New York ran with cautious headlines. "Germany claims Polish attack. Poland denies. Europe on brink of war." The truth was still trapped between two versions of reality. And while the world argued over who fired the first shot, the skies over Poland turned black with smoke. Within 24 hours, German forces had captured dozens of Polish towns. Hitler, confident in his deception, sent a smug telegram to Mussolini. "Everything is proceeding as planned. The world believes us." But not everyone did. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier weren't convinced. They had seen this movie before. Hitler had lied about Austria, lied about Czechoslovakia, and now it was happening again. Still, they hesitated. They wanted to be sure. And in those 2 days of hesitation, the fate of millions was sealed. By September 3rd, the truth had finally surfaced. Reports from diplomats, witnesses, and border guards revealed that the so-called Polish attacks were staged. Even the timing didn't add up. How could Poland have organized simultaneous strikes across hundreds of kilometers with no evidence of preparation? It was obvious. The aggression was a show. That same day, Britain and France issued an ultimatum. Withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler didn't respond. He didn't need to. The dominoes were already falling. And when the deadline passed, Chamberlain stepped onto the radio in London and uttered the words that would define an era. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany." The world gasped. It had happened again. Just 21 years after the war to end all wars. But this time it started not with the assassination of an archduke, not with an empire's collapse, but with a fake radio broadcast and a pile of corpses dressed in stolen uniforms. That's how fragile peace was. That's how powerful a lie could be. As tanks thundered across Poland, Goebbels smiled to himself. He had done it. A world war, born from the flick of a microphone switch. But he wasn't celebrating long, because propaganda, once unleashed, becomes a beast that even its master cannot control. Inside Germany, the frenzy he had created began to take on a life of its own. People didn't just believe in the lie, they built their patriotism on it. They demanded vengeance, conquest, purity. The story that began at Gleiwitz had mutated into something unstoppable. And yet, even as Goebbels gloated, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. Because truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a habit of clawing its way out. The tanks kept rolling. The bombs kept falling. And for a while the Gleiwitz lie held strong. Inside Germany, the people believed it, or at least they pretended to, because in a dictatorship, pretending often felt safer than doubting. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines: "Poland defeated," "German blood avenged," and across the country, Nazi propaganda flooded every living room, every theater, every radio frequency. But beyond Germany's borders, something wasn't adding up. British intelligence began collecting intercepts from the German front. None of them mentioned Polish attacks before the invasion. Not one. Then there were the corpses, the supposed Polish saboteurs found at the Gleiwitz radio tower. When investigators looked closer, inconsistencies jumped out. Their uniforms didn't match Polish military issue. Their boots were German. Their identification papers looked brand new, too clean, too deliberate. And the bodies. They didn't die in a firefight. They had been killed execution style. That was the first sign that something deeply sinister had taken place. In the early months of the war, though, no one dared speak up publicly. The world had been plunged into chaos. Poland fell within weeks. France would collapse less than a year later, and soon bombs were falling on London itself. The Gleiwitz Incident, that strange, suspicious little story, was buried beneath mountains of blood and rubble. But it wasn't forgotten. After Germany's defeat in 1945, the Allies began uncovering the full machinery of the Nazi state. Files, diaries, coded telegrams, every shred of documentation they could find was collected, read, translated, analyzed. And then they came across the confessions. Captured SS officers, desperate to save themselves, began talking. Among them was Alfred Naujoks, the man who had led the Gleiwitz operation. In interrogation, he finally admitted what happened. He told them how Heydrich had personally ordered him to create a border incident that could justify war. How he had been given a team of trusted SS men. How they dressed in Polish uniforms. How they dragged prisoners, dressed to look like Polish saboteurs, to the site. How those prisoners were killed and left behind as evidence. And how, after it was over, he made the fake radio announcement claiming a Polish attack on German soil. When investigators asked him if he understood what that broadcast would unleash, he said quietly, "I was a soldier. I followed orders." At the Nuremberg trials, his testimony became a key piece of evidence. It confirmed that the German invasion of Poland, and therefore World War II itself, had been launched on the basis of a deliberate lie. The Gleiwitz incident wasn't just a false flag. It was the blueprint for modern disinformation. The world learned that Hitler had staged not just one fake attack, but a series of them, over 20 in total, all designed to create the illusion of Polish aggression. One of the prosecutors famously said during the trial, "This war began not with an army, but with a broadcast." That line struck deep, because it wasn't just about 1939. It was about how easily truth can be twisted, how quickly a lie can become history, and how fragile reality becomes when power controls the microphone. In post-war Germany, the name Gleiwitz became something of a curse, a reminder of how the Nazi regime manipulated patriotism into violence. The radio station itself, bombed during the war, was rebuilt, and today it still stands in what is now Gleiwitz, Poland, as a museum and a warning. Visitors walk through exhibits showing old radio equipment, Nazi documents, and photographs of the supposed saboteurs. One display has a single German SS uniform on a mannequin. Next to it, a sign reads, "Warned to start a war." It's haunting. Fuelin förbyttes till silbernaserna. But here's the strange part. Even after Nojoks confessed, some people still refuse to believe the truth. For years, conspiracy theories floated around claiming the event was exaggerated or propaganda from the other side. That's the dark irony of the Gleiwitz story. It was born from disinformation, and decades later it still breeds it, because when a lie is powerful enough, it doesn't die easily. It lingers, mutates, and resurfaces whenever history starts to rhyme. Fuelin förbyttes till silbernaserna. Think about it. A single fake broadcast, less than a minute long, set the world on fire. Millions would die in the war that followed. Cities would burn, empires would fall, and entire generations would be scarred forever. And it all began with a handful of men in a radio tower, a corpse in a borrowed uniform, and a lie. Fuelin förbyttes till silbernaserna. But this wasn't just a story about Germany in 1939. It's a story about every era, every time power has tried to weaponize truth, every time fear has been dressed up as righteousness, every time someone said, "We were attacked," when they were the ones holding the match. The Gleiwitz Incident wasn't just the opening act of World War II. It was a lesson, written in blood, that truth once corrupted can destroy the world. Fuelin förbyttes till silbernaserna. By the time Nojoks was released from prison years later, he was a ghost of himself. He lived quietly in Hamburg, avoiding the public eye. He never showed remorse, never made amends, never apologized. He once said to a journalist, "If I hadn't done it, someone else would have. It was history." Cold words from the man who helped fake the spark that lit humanity's darkest fire. Fuelin förbyttes till silbernaserna. And so the Gleiwitz Tower stands today, tall, silent, and slightly crooked against the Polish skyline. It doesn't broadcast anymore. It only listens to footsteps of visitors, to the whisper of the wind through broken wires. And maybe if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the ghost of that false broadcast. That one short message that turned truth into fiction, and fiction into war. The Gleiwitz Tower stands still. It doesn't broadcast lies anymore. It simply stands, a monument to the quiet power of words and the catastrophic consequences of deception. If you visit it today, the guide might tell you, this is where the war began. Not in the trenches, not in the skies, but here, through a radio broadcast that was never meant to be heard by the truth. After World War II ended, the world tried to rebuild not just cities, but trust. Trust in institutions, trust in facts, trust in the idea that words could heal rather than destroy. But even as the rubble settled, the ghost of Gleiwitz refused to fade. Because what the Nazis created that night wasn't just a false flag. It was a blueprint, a formula. If you ever want to start a war, don't begin with soldiers. Begin with a story. The formula worked like this. Step 1. Invent an enemy. Give the people a villain to hate, someone to fear, someone whose existence justifies your violence. Step 2. Stage the evidence. A photo, a report, a witness, a convenient crisis that looks real enough to silence questions. Step 3. Unbroadcast the lie. Loudly, confidently, and everywhere. Repeat it until doubt feels like betrayal. And Step 4. Act fast, because truth is slow. It takes time to investigate, time to think, time to prove. But lies? Lies can move at the speed of panic. When Hitler's forces rolled into Poland, the world barely had time to breathe. The war machine had already been justified, televised and sealed by a single fake incident. By the time anyone realized what had really happened, it was too late. The lie had done its job. The match had already hit the fuse. Fast forward decades later, and the echoes of Gleiwitz can still be felt. Every time a government spreads alternative facts, every time footage is staged to push a narrative, every time a story breaks before the truth is ready, you can almost hear that radio crackle again, the static, the voice reading a script, the illusion of danger, the certainty of righteousness. History doesn't always repeat itself. Sometimes it just updates the graphics. The truth about the Gleiwitz incident only came out because the liars lost. If Germany had won the war, who knows what the official version would be? Maybe history books would still describe a heroic defense against Polish aggression. Maybe kids would grow up believing their nation had been attacked. Maybe that fake broadcast would still echo as truth. That's the terrifying part. Lies only die when someone bothers to kill them. But truth is a strange thing. It's fragile, yes, but it's also stubborn. It has a way of surfacing, even after decades of being buried. The Nuremberg trials proved that. Documents were dug up, witnesses spoke out, and the story of Gleiwitz became a case study in how far propaganda can go when left unchecked. Today, the word Gleiwitz is used in military academies and history classes around the world. It's become shorthand for deception, for when governments create the illusion of being victims to justify aggression. But in Poland, in the small town where it happened, the locals just call it Gleiwitz. They go about their lives, passing the old wooden radio tower that once carried the lie that changed the planet. And sometimes school children are brought to see it. They listen quietly as guides explain the story. You can see it in their eyes. The confusion, the disbelief, the dawning realization that history's monsters didn't always look like monsters at first. They looked ordinary, professional, disciplined, convincing. They looked like people reading the news. And that's what makes it so haunting, because the power of propaganda doesn't come from evil men shouting obvious lies. It comes from calm voices saying dangerous things that sound reasonable, from microphones that sound like authority, from uniforms that look like order. That's what Gleiwitz taught us. That truth can die not in battle but in broadcast. If you strip it down to its bones. The Gleiwitz incident is a story about fear. Fear being weaponized to control perception. And yet it's also a story about exposure. About how in the end, lies collapse under their own weight. It took years, but eventually the world saw through the illusion. The actors were unmasked. The script was revealed. The only tragedy is how many people had to die before the truth came out. When you watch the old footage now, grainy black and white, of Goebbels giving speeches, of Hitler smiling to the crowds, of soldiers marching off to what they thought was righteous war, you can almost hear the echo of that one small radio transmission, a lie that justified an empire, a story that unleashed a storm, and all of it, because one man wanted the world to believe they were under attack. Certainly Sylvie der de Fournier Fature. There's a quote from an Allied investigator who helped compile the Nuremberg files. He said, Gleiwitz was not an event, it was a warning that still applies today. Because as long as humans can be persuaded, as long as fear can be sold, as long as stories can travel faster than facts, there will always be another Gleiwitz waiting in the shadows. Certainly Sylvie der de Fournier Fature. So next time you hear a story that sounds a little too convenient, a headline that seems perfectly timed, or a message that demands outrage before understanding, remember that quiet little radio tower in Poland, because once upon a time, it broadcast a lie so powerful it started a world war. Certainly Sylvie der de Fournier Fature. The screen fades to black. The static hums. Then faintly a voice whispers, "This is Gleiwitz radio station. Poland attacked us." A lie so small, so simple, yet strong enough to set the world on fire.